Alright guys, so we're talking about domain and range today. And what I really want to hit on right now is how do you find the domain and the range of a graph? We're going to look at this in multiple ways, but the big thing that you want to know, whenever we have any type of curve, line, or any other graph, what we're basically interested in is the starting and ending points of the graph. That's the most simple way to put it. I'm looking at boundaries, okay? Um, if this was a graphing calculator, for instance, there would be no need to use a 20 by 20 window to look at this because I'm only going from 6 to -4 and from -3 to 3. And what I just named right there, 6 to -4 and -3 to 3, I just named my domain and range, believe it or not. So the important thing to remember is domain is the set of all inputs. So in other words, it's things on the x-axis. So to make it really, really simple, if I start where my curve starts on the x-axis and I highlight where it ends from here to here, that is my domain. Okay, I would say the domain here is from -4 to 6. In this case, I'm going to write it like this. Similarly, my range is from -3 to 3. There's nothing too complicated about it. Now, there is a little trick with this as far as my notation goes. Up until this point, we have been using, these are called indices, that's the formal name, to describe our domain and range. So if I had a domain of 3, 4, and 6, then I would use indices rather than parentheses. So what this would look like literally if I had points, 3, 4, and 6. And maybe I just have a range of 0 here. They're all 0, the y-coordinate. So obviously this would still be a function, not a very exciting one. And notice that these are not connected. So the difference is when you have a curve and points are connected, you're going to want to use parentheses. When you have individual points that are not connected, then we use the indices. So let me give you another one really quickly here, and just a quick refresher. If I don't know, had a few points here, here, and here, I think you worked on finding the domain and range earlier, right? We would use indices, and I would say the domain equals, let's see here, 3, 1, and -4, maybe in the correct order, -4, 1, and 3. I could do the range as well. I think it would be 1, 2, and 4, right? However, I can turn this into a curve very simply by just drawing points through them. So drawing my curve through these points. And something I want to bring up here is the endpoints. So notice on the left side of this curve, I have a point that's filled in. And on the right side of this curve, I have what looks like an empty circle. The way I'm going to write this now, domain, remember domain is the x-axis. Starting at -6, I'm using parentheses now. And ending at 4. So because I'm introducing this open-close thing, I need to have a way to write that in my domain. And what this basically means is that this line approaches 4, but it doesn't actually include this point. This point is actually not in the domain. It goes right up until then, but then doesn't exist. To give you a real-world example of this, maybe we're talking about how much a person could weigh. I think the minimum amount that a person could weigh would be maybe 1 ounce, right? Not quite 0, because if you don't weigh anything, then you don't exist, but really, really close to 0, right? You could, maybe you could be born prematurely and be really light, less than a pound, right? But you can't quite be 0 pounds, so we wouldn't include that point in our domain. And so the way we write this now, forget what I said before, we use parentheses whenever we want to omit that point. So in this case, 4 stays the same with parentheses. But on this other end, I'm going to use a bracket for 6. And what this says, this bracket says that, hey, this -6 is actually included, whereas this 4 is not included. Same thing for our range. Our range goes from -3 to 4. But again, the -3 isn't actually included, so I need to use parentheses. But I do want to include the 4 because there's actually a point there filled in, and the way I'll do that is with the bracket. So it gets a little confusing because now we're using indices, brackets, and parentheses, and that's really confusing. But again, quick review: indices are used for points, parentheses are used to not include that point in a range, and then brackets are used to include that point in a range. All right. Other than that, you know, the domain just goes from the beginning and the end of a curve on the x-axis, whereas the range goes from the beginning and end of the curve on the y-axis. I think you guys can manage that. So you're going to try a little practice for me, and hopefully it goes okay. Let me know if you have any questions.